My name is Ethan Carter, and 3 years ago I bought a piece of land for $3, 100 that everyone in town laughed at. By the end of that same month, the people laughing were sitting in a crowded community meeting begging me to sign a deal worth nearly $250,000. The crazy part is I never set out to beat anybody. I wasn't looking for revenge, and I definitely wasn't trying to take on an entire HOA. I just happened to open a locked concrete box that nobody thought I'd ever bother looking inside. I live in a small place outside Millfield, Colorado. Nothing fancy, just a modest ranch house with a gravel driveway and a detached garage that's always half full of electrical supplies. I've been an electrician most of my adult life, the kind of guy who notices wiring, utility poles, transformers, and all the boring infrastructure everybody else ignores. My wife used a joke that I could drive through a neighborhood and tell you more about the power grid than the houses themselves. Maybe that's why this whole thing happened. Maybe if someone else had bought that land, none of it would have ever come to light. It started with a phone call from a man named Preston Whitaker. Now, Preston was one of those people who seemed to have spent his entire life wearing expensive jackets and talking down to people without technically being rude. Former attorney, former developer, former HOA president. The kind of guy who always sounded like he was doing you a favor even when he was taking your money. I met him a couple times over the years doing electrical work around town. He never remembered my name exactly. Sometimes I was Eric. Sometimes Evan. Once he called me Edward for an entire conversation. That should have told me everything I needed to know. The day he called, he sounded unusually friendly. He told me he knew about a small parcel of land coming available behind the Cedar Ridge Estates community and thought it might interest me. I asked why. He laughed and said, "Honestly, Ethan, it probably won't. It's basically worthless." Whenever real estate guys start a sentence with honestly, I automatically get suspicious. A few days later, I drove over to take a look. Cedar Ridge Estates was the kind of place that looked perfect from the outside. Neatly trimmed lawns, expensive townhomes, decorative streetlights, luxury SUVs parked in every driveway. You know the type. The HOA newsletters probably used words like community excellence and neighborhood standards every other paragraph. The parcel itself sat tucked behind the tennis courts near a retention pond. 20 feet wide, maybe 30 feet deep. Dry grass. Cracked dirt. Nothing special. If you didn't know it existed, you'd never notice it. The only thing sitting on the lot was a beige concrete utility structure about the size of a garden shed. No windows. Stale door. Slight humming sound coming from inside. I remember standing there staring at it while Preston talked. He kept calling the lot useless. Kept explaining how nobody wanted it. Kept emphasizing how little value it had. Looking back, that should have been another warning sign. People don't usually spend 15 minutes convincing you something has no value unless they're worried you'll discover that it does. Then came the paperwork. Preston had everything prepared before I even arrived. Documents already organized. Tabs marked. Signature lines highlighted. He smiled and handed me the packet. "Just standard utility easement language," he said. "Most buyers don't bother reading that section. Most buyers don't bother reading." I don't know why that sentence got stuck in my head, but it did. Maybe because my father spent 30 years working construction and drilled one lesson into me growing up. Read everything. Doesn't matter if it's a warranty card, a contract, or a restaurant receipt. Read it. So instead of signing immediately, I sat on the tailgate of my truck and started going through the paperwork page by page. Preston's smile faded a little, then a little more. He suddenly seemed eager to leave. That made me even more curious. I took the documents home and spent the next few nights reviewing every line. Nothing jumped out immediately. No obvious froth. No hidden traps. But something felt off. The utility language seemed strangely vague. There were references to infrastructure without clear ownership documentation. Certain sections referred to facilities while never specifically identifying them. It wasn't enough to stop me from buying the parcel, but it was enough to convince me to keep digging after the purchase. A week later, I paid cash and became the legal owner. Preston shook my hand. His smile returned. He looked relieved. That's the word that sticks with me now, relieved. At the time, I assumed he was just happy to unload a useless lot. Today, I know better. The morning after closing, I grabbed my toolbox and headed back out there. I wasn't looking for buried treasure. I wasn't expecting some massive discovery. I was mostly curious about that concrete structure. Electricians are naturally curious about things that hum. The steel door was secured but accessible from my property. Everything was legal. Everything was mine. So I unlocked it, pulled the door open, and took my first look inside. The second that door swung open, my entire understanding of that purchase changed. I remember just standing there staring into the darkness while dozens of thoughts collided inside my head at once. Because what I saw wasn't a simple utility box, and the more I looked, the more impossible the situation became. Because what I saw wasn't a simple utility box, and the more I looked, the more impossible the situation became. Inside that structure sat a transformer system, multiple breaker panels, water control equipment, emergency disconnects, and rows of labeled circuits. At first I thought maybe it served a few nearby buildings. But then I started reading the tags. Pool, clubhouse, East Street lighting, West Street lighting, Building A, Building B, Building C. The labels kept going. I counted them twice because I thought I had to be misunderstanding something. Then I traced the incoming and outgoing lines. That's when my stomach dropped. Every major utility feed for Cedar Ridge Estates ran through equipment sitting entirely on my property. I actually laughed out loud the first time the realization hit, because it seemed too ridiculous to be real. I stood there alone inside that humming concrete room, saying, "No way. Absolutely no way." But the more I looked, the worse it got. Over the next several days, I started pulling public records. One document led to another, then another. Soon I was spending evenings buried in county archives, engineering maps, old planning approvals, and property records dating back nearly 2 decades. My wife, Sarah, kept finding me at the kitchen table after midnight, surrounded by papers. One night she sat down across from me and asked what exactly I was looking for. I remember sliding a stack of documents toward her and saying, "Honestly, at this point I'm trying to figure out how something this big happened without anybody noticing." Because the deeper I dug, the stranger the story became. Cedar Ridge Estates had been developed almost 18 years earlier during a massive construction boom. The original developer built the neighborhood, installed the infrastructure, then sold homes as fast as possible. Somewhere along the way, that tiny utility parcel had been separated from the surrounding common property. Maybe intentionally, maybe by mistake. What mattered was what happened afterward. Nobody fixed it. Not the developer, not the attorneys, not the HOA boards that came and went over the years. Somehow 18 years passed while critical infrastructure remained on land the community never legally owned. Then came the discovery that changed everything. I couldn't find a valid easement. I couldn't find a lease. I couldn't find a maintenance agreement. I couldn't find any recorded document giving the HOA permanent legal rights to occupy the parcel. Nothing. I even hired a title researcher because I assumed I had to be missing something. A week later, she called me. "You're not missing anything," she said. "I've never seen a situation quite like this." I remember hanging up and just sitting there quietly. Not excited, not celebrating, just stunned. Because suddenly I understood why Preston had been so eager to sell. The lot wasn't worthless. It was the exact opposite. It was potentially the most important piece of land in the entire neighborhood. The problem wasn't that they didn't know. The problem was that they probably knew enough to be nervous. Once that realization settled in, I hired a surveyor named Hank Morrison. Hank was the kind of guy who looked 70 years old at 55 because he'd spent his life outdoors. He spent 2 days measuring, verifying boundaries, and reviewing utility placement. On the 3rd afternoon, he climbed into my truck and tossed a folder onto the center console. "Well," he said, "good news if you're the owner." I opened the folder. Every structure sat squarely inside my property line. No ambiguity, no overlap, no technical gray area, just clean legal ownership. That's when I made my first serious phone call. Not to Preston, not to the HOA, to an attorney. Her name was Rebecca Lawson, and after reviewing everything, she spent nearly 10 seconds staring at me without speaking. Finally, she leaned back and asked, "Do they know?" I said, "Know what?" She smiled slightly. "How much trouble they're in." Rebecca drafted a formal letter. Professional, direct, no threats, no drama. The letter simply informed the HOA that critical infrastructure occupied privately owned property without documented legal rights and requested that the situation be resolved through either removal or negotiated agreement within 30 days. That's it. We sent it certified mail. Then we waited. For days later, my phone rang. Preston. The confidence in his voice was gone. Completely gone. Ethan, he said, trying very hard to sound calm. There seems to be some misunderstanding. I leaned back in my chair. Which part? Silence. Then he said, you can't seriously intend to enforce this. I remember looking out the window toward my driveway while he spoke. A younger version of me would have gotten angry. A younger version would have enjoyed hearing panic in his voice. Instead, I just felt disappointed. Because the truth was simple. They had spent years assuming nobody like me would ever look closely enough. Preston, I said, I didn't create this situation. Another pause. Then his tone changed. Less friendly. More threatening. You need to understand the consequences if utilities are interrupted. Good thing I haven't interrupted anything, I replied. Have a nice day. Then I hung up. The next few weeks became increasingly bizarre. HOA attorneys started sending letters. Rebecca responded to every one of them. They implied community hardship. She responded with property law. They talked about expectations. She talked about ownership. They talked about fairness. She talked about recorded documents. Every conversation seemed to end in the same place. They didn't own the land. I did. Then something happened that shifted the balance completely. Rebecca explained that while negotiations continued, I had every legal right to secure my property, not interfere with operations, not damage equipment, simply secure access. So on the 7th day after the certified notice period began, I installed an 8-foot security fence around the parcel. Commercial grade, luktgata, clean professional construction. Then I added a sign, private property, contact owner for access authorization. That sign spread through Cedar Ridge Estates faster than a wildfire. Within 48 hours, neighborhood social media pages exploded. Residents who had never heard of the parcel suddenly wanted answers. Questions turned into frustration. Frustration turned into panic. Panic turned into anger. Unfortunately for the HOA board, most of that anger wasn't directed at me. Homeowners started asking how 18 years of leadership had failed to secure ownership of infrastructure supporting millions of dollars in property value. That's when Preston finally showed up in person. I almost didn't recognize him. The polished executive image was gone. He arrived driving an older sedan instead of the luxury SUV I'd seen for years. His tie was crooked. His eyes looked exhausted. We stood near the fence while the transformer hummed quietly behind us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed. Let's be reasonable. I couldn't help smiling. Not because I wanted to humiliate him, but because I remembered every conversation we'd ever had. Every time he'd acted like I was invisible. Every time he'd assumed he was the smartest person in the room. Reasonable? I asked. You sold me the property. He looked away. Nobody expected. He stopped. I finished the sentence for him. Nobody expected me to read the records. The expression on his face told me everything. He knew. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not the full legal exposure. But enough. Enough to understand why this disaster existed. Enough to understand why they had wanted the parcel gone. I handed him a folder containing our proposed settlement framework. He flipped through the pages while his face slowly drained of color. Back rent calculations. Lease alternatives. Purchase options. Liability concerns. Future governance provisions. The numbers weren't random. They were supported by market valuations and legal analysis. Preston reached the last page and looked up. The homeowners will never agree to this. I shrugged. Then they'll need another solution. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Wind rattled the fence behind us. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower started up. It was one of the strangest moments of my life because I realized the power dynamic had completely reversed. The guy who once acted like he was doing me favors was now standing on my property asking for mine. 3 days later, an emergency HOA meeting was scheduled. Homeowners packed the conference room. Attorneys filled the back wall. Board members sat stiffly at the front table. And for the first time since this entire thing started, everyone involved would be forced to confront the same uncomfortable truth. The community's biggest problem wasn't sitting outside behind the tennis courts. It was sitting inside that room, buried beneath 18 years of assumptions, shortcuts, and mistakes that nobody wanted to admit existed. The community's biggest problem wasn't sitting outside behind the tennis courts. It was sitting inside that room, buried beneath 18 years of assumptions, shortcuts, and mistakes that nobody wanted to admit existed. When I walked into that emergency meeting, the atmosphere felt heavier than any courtroom I'd ever been in. About 60 homeowners had shown up in person, and judging by the faces around the room, most of them had arrived expecting to meet some greedy villain holding their neighborhood hostage. Instead, they got me, a guy in work boots who had spent the morning wiring a commercial kitchen before driving over. I took a seat near Rebecca while conversations buzzed around the room. Some people looked angry. Some looked nervous. Some looked completely confused because they had only recently learned that a tiny forgotten parcel behind the tennis courts had become the most important piece of land in Cedar Ridge Estates. The board president opened the meeting and immediately launched into a carefully prepared statement about cooperation, community values, and finding solutions. Nobody was listening. Homeowners wanted answers. One woman stood up and asked the question everyone had been thinking. How did this happen? The room went silent. Nobody on the board seemed eager to answer. Finally, another resident stood and asked an even harder question. Who knew about it? That one hit like a hammer. Eyes slowly drifted toward Preston. He stared down at the table. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked small. Not powerful. Not intimidating. Just tired. The attorneys eventually redirected the conversation toward negotiations. Rebecca presented our position calmly and professionally. We weren't demanding anything outrageous. We weren't threatening utility interruptions. We weren't trying to punish homeowners. We were offering a path to permanently solve a problem they should have fixed years ago. Then came the numbers. The parcel purchase price. The compensation for years of unauthorized use. The legal protections moving forward. The governance provisions intended to prevent future abuse. Murmurs spread through the crowd. One homeowner jumped to his feet. This sounds like extortion. Before I could respond, Rebecca did. She folded her hands and said, "No, sir. Extortion is demanding money without legal rights. Property ownership is the exact opposite." You could practically hear the air leave the room, because everybody understood she was right. Whether they liked it or not, the facts weren't changing. For nearly 2 hours, the discussion continued. Questions, arguments, frustration, more questions. Yet every road led back to the same reality. If the community fought, legal costs alone could become enormous. If they lost, the outcome could become even more expensive. Eventually, something surprising happened. The homeowners stopped focusing on me and started focusing on the people who had allowed the situation to exist in the first place. One by one, residents began asking why previous boards never corrected the issue, why ownership records weren't reviewed, why nobody secured permanent rights to critical infrastructure, why warnings were ignored. The room slowly transformed from an attack on me into an investigation of their own leadership. Preston never said much during that part. He mostly sat quietly while years of decisions caught up with him all at once. By the end of the evening, the board requested a private executive session. Everyone waited outside. Homeowners gathered in small groups. Some were angry. Some actually approached me and thanked me for uncovering the problem before it became even worse. One older resident surprised me by shaking my hand and saying, "You know, if you'd never bought that lot, we'd probably still have no idea." About 40 minutes later, the board returned. The vote was unanimous. They accepted the agreement. Just like that, months of uncertainty ended. The community would purchase the parcel. Compensation would be paid. New legal protections would be recorded. The infrastructure would finally sit on land properly controlled by the people depending on it. Nobody cheered. It wasn't that kind of victory. It felt more like a long, overdue correction. 30 days later, the funds cleared. Every document was signed. Every transfer was completed. The issue that had been ignored for 18 years was finally resolved. The morning everything became official, I received something I never expected. A formal letter addressed to every homeowner in Cedar Ridge Estates acknowledging the oversight, explaining the resolution, and accepting responsibility for the failures that created the situation. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional, but it mattered. Accountability usually does. That same day, Preston resigned from every remaining leadership position he held within the community. I heard about it through a mutual acquaintance. Apparently, his resignation lasted less than 2 minutes. No speeches, no arguments, just a quiet exit. A few weeks later, life mostly returned to normal. I went back to electrical work. Sarah went back to teasing me whenever I started talking about utility infrastructure at dinner. The headlines faded. The gossip faded. The outrage faded. But every now and then I'd think about how differently everything could have gone. If I hadn't opened that concrete box, if I hadn't read the paperwork, if I'd accepted what everyone told me without asking questions, the entire situation would have remained hidden. Sometimes the most valuable thing in a transaction isn't what people show you. It's what they're hoping you'll ignore. To this day, I still keep 2 framed documents hanging in my home office. The first is the original deed from that little parcel. The second is a copy of the community acknowledgement letter that followed. Visitors occasionally ask why I keep them there. The answer is simple. They remind me that titles, appearances, and confidence don't automatically equal competence. They remind me that ordinary people have more power than they think when they're willing to do their homework. Most importantly, they remind me that the truth has a funny way of surfacing, even after nearly 2 decades underground. Now here's the part that still divides people whenever this story comes up. Some folks think I did exactly what any property owner should have done. Others think I should have simply handed the land over and walked away once I discovered the mistake. I've heard both arguments, and honestly, I can understand pieces of each side. But if a group of people benefited from something for 18 years without ever securing the rights to it, who should carry the responsibility when that oversight finally comes due? The person who uncovered the problem, or the people who ignored it? I'd really like to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have handled it differently? Would you have negotiated, fought harder, accepted less, demanded more? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this is one of those stories where the line between fairness and opportunity isn't always as clear as people want it to be. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, a property dispute, or a situation where one small document changed everything, share your experience too. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.